Thanks everybody for coming, and thanks to everybody online for also joining us today. I'm good. Thanks also to Vicky de Guzman and Jan Giuliano for inviting me to talk and for providing an opening for discussion of transportation collision with ecosystems. And that term is kind of chosen intentionally, or is chosen intentionally, because a lot of what I'm going to talk about, it does involve collisions, but I'll also talk about effects that are independent of collisions. Our center, the Road Ecology Center, studies wildlife movement, impacts of transportation on ecosystems, impacts of ecosystem on transportation, which is a new one, and that's basically sea level rise impacts on shoreline infrastructure, which is a reciprocal relationship on the shoreline where sea level rise impacts ecosystems and they impact shoreline infrastructure and so on. This is a brief outline of what I'll talk about today. Most of what I'll say will fit into these four categories, and it'll be in this order. The first thing I'm going to talk about is framing the discussion about transportation and ecosystems within a meme, a concept called ecologically sustainable transportation. And I'll talk about that briefly. And then I'll talk about road effects, both far from roadways and immediately adjacent to roadways. Towards the halfway point of the talk, you'll see that I'm mostly focusing on wildlife. And then I'll talk about resolution. And it's a question mark because we don't necessarily know how to resolve some of the issues that I'll bring up. One thing that I do want to say is that I want you to ask questions. Any comment or question that comes to mind, please raise your hand if you're in the room and let me know. I'm not sure if the web people can ask questions. Is that, yeah, they can type questions? All right, so they presumably got those instructions to type some questions. So sustainable transportation is a term you'll see throughout the US and the world these days associated with transportation, and it's really an aspiration. We want to think that we can be sustainable in a lot of different ways, energy use, building on landscapes, and transportation. And it has definition, sustainability has definition, and sustainable transportation has some definition. And it's built around the idea that we want to make sure that things we do now don't affect the future opportunities for future generations and don't affect land, water, air, humanity, or health in ways that are irreversible. Ecologically sustainable transportation then is a subset of that idea. It's saying that if we build or maintain or rely upon transportation systems, if we want to consider them sustainable, then they should have at least neutral impacts or mitigatable impacts on natural systems. So we need to know what those impacts are, and we need to have mechanisms for reducing those impacts. This is also aspirational. It doesn't really have very good definition. Sustainable transportation, environmentally sustainable transportation, ecologically sustainable transportation. Those are all terms that are used with different frequencies, but they don't necessarily have great definition. The measurement system for ecologically sustainable transportation is road ecology. And the term road ecology, I'll define in a minute, but you can think of it as a suite of ways of measuring impacts and trying to resolve them. It's a very practical art. And this is a brief definition. There's probably other ways to define it. But basically, it's the study of impacts of transportation systems, and it's tied also to how can we resolve these. One way to picture those impacts is that they're originating from the roadway by definition, or railway, or some other transportation structure, and they're emanating outwards in multiple dimensions. This shows going across the landscape into the land, so vibration, water and soil contamination, into the air, noise and various pollutants. And here's a list of some of those types of impacts that you might see from transportation systems that really form the basis for road ecology. The reason that this is important globally is that if you look at the bottom of the slide, the map of the world, these are roads, just roads, no rail, no power lines, no canals, which are other forms of infrastructure with similar impacts. These are roads throughout the world. And so we've roaded a lot of the world. And obviously, these areas that are solid black, that doesn't mean that there's nothing in between. But for those of you who've been to the East Coast or parts of Southern Asia or Europe, you know that roads can be very close together, and sometimes nature and natural processes are very fragmented by that. So essentially, this means that our transportation development system and use of the system potentially could impact a lot of different aspects of nature and human communities, but I'll focus mostly on nature today. There's lots of different ways that people are trying to get a handle on this. The map I showed before was part of an ongoing study of what does road system development look like in the parts of the world where there hasn't been as much road development. This is a paper that was in Science looking at the effect of having roads throughout the world with pieces of nature in between. And so they focused their view of roads on what we call roadless areas. So these maps show the relationship between road systems and adjacent pieces of landscape. And so the more orange the landscape, the closer a road is to another road, and therefore there's less space between them. And you can see where the developed areas of the world, there's a lot of areas with a road within a kilometer, that's the red, and only in a few places, and not surprising places in the world, the Sahara, the Amazon, and the Arctic, do you have very large areas. And the importance of these is that this is where nature can really function unimpeded, except for climate change, atmospheric pollutants, et cetera. But besides those trivial things, a lot of these landscapes can function because they don't have roads nearby. And the reason I say that is that we do have a good handle on some of the different kinds of impacts that transportation can have. And so if a road isn't nearby, then presumably most of those impacts aren't occurring. So from a global point of view, we can start to get an idea of how much influence are we actually having across the whole world. If we zoom in, we can use a concept developed by Richard Foreman in the 2003 Road Ecology text, which is really the basis for the field, insofar as it is a field. And the term road effect zone comes from that book, and the ideas contained within this come from that book. And it's as it sounds, and you could put the rail effect zone, the airplane effect zone, or shipping effect zone in there as well. But basically, the transportation effect is the area around a transportation route that has some predictable types of impacts, and that those may dissipate in a predictable way with distance and environmental conditions, or they may not. It may be very hard to predict how those impacts are going to dissipate over space and time. Importantly, these are generally, traffic is a rate process, and nature is full of rate processes, and actually nature is formed and society is formed by rate processes. So everything we see around us is both a result of a rate process and can influence rate processes. So I'm leaving time out of a lot of what I'm discussing, but it's an important influence in the background. So we have this road effect zone around rail, roads, et cetera. We have this transportation influence, and it can extend probably a lot farther than most people think. So for example, if you have a roadway or railway crossing a stream and it has a constrained channel, the effects on that stream channel can go up and downstream over a mile or kilometers, and similar for various atmospheric pollutants, carbon dioxide obviously being, and different forms of nitrogen being good examples of very long distance impacts. But if you look at things that are a little more contained, like noise and light, you still get a fairly wide margin around the transportation route where you're going to have these effects. These are pretty, I'm saying these are pretty broad effects. I'm not getting into detail about what is being affected, so much as saying that these effects do occur. And now the traffic effect occurs, the extrapolation of some noise, light, pollutants, et cetera. We don't necessarily know what the impacts of those. So in human populations, human health, we have some idea that if you have a noisy road near a developed area, you might have changes in morbidity, and that's one way to measure things. Diesel exhaust down the 710 going through communities in south of Los Angeles is another type of effect that could be thought of as a human health impact or road effect zone impact on human communities. You're going to have the same kinds of effects, in some cases exactly the same effects, and others similar effects on natural systems. I'm going to talk about wildlife as a fairly easy way to discuss transportation system impacts on ecosystems. And one of the reasons, besides convenience, because I work on wildlife, one of the reasons I want to do that is that wildlife are really a concentration of energy in ecosystems. Similar to humans are concentrations of energy in societies and developed landscapes, wildlife are sort of the analog. And because we're bonded to them in an aesthetic sense, we spend a lot of money thinking about them and sometimes on killing them. We do a lot that's related to wildlife, and so they're really also a concentration of social concern. There's a lot of different kinds of impacts of wildlife that can occur from transportation systems, and I've listed some here with these fairly large ideas. The first is that when animals attempt to cross a transportation way and they collide with traffic, then you could have injury or mortality, and that has a fragmenting effect, a separating effect on wildlife populations. It also has a direct effect on the size of the population because you're killing off individuals of the population. Another is that the animal attempts to cross and it does so successfully, and we can think of that as a connection, a type of connectivity. And so as opposed to a fragmentation with a collision, this is actually a connection event. And so that's a good thing, but it may be incidental to the construction of the transportation, or it could be part of the way that the transportation was constructed. A third, which is much less well understood, is aversion effects on wildlife. And what this means is that, and you could feel this as a human, if there's a loud freeway, highway, railway, you're not attracted to it. You don't necessarily want to be near it. You will only be near it if you have to. You're certainly not going to sit in a park next to a loud freeway by choice if you have another option. And so there's an aversion effect on wildlife, and it affects different species differently, different individuals within a population differently. Think of school kids versus somebody like me are going to have different responses to noise and noisy freeways. And so you can fragment wildlife populations and ecosystems with this aversion effect. And then finally, which is less common but is also important, is that there's an attraction effect of transportation as well. So some examples: rail distribution or shipping of grain is not a 100% intact process, and so you get grain spread out along railways. Animals that like to eat grain come along and they eat the grain on the railway, and then they get killed by the next train. So there's an attraction effect. This is true for salt on roadways with de-icing, and also scavenging animals who walk along roadways to look for dead animals that were hit by a car, and then they in turn are hit by a car. There's a couple of types of impacts here I want to focus on. I'm going to focus on them quite a bit. And these are mortality effects and fragmentation or connectivity effects. The first one is primarily where traffic vehicles hit an animal and the animal is injured or killed. In California, we find that in California Highway Patrol reports of traffic incidents where an animal is part of a collision, about a third of the time the animal is injured on site and is not leaving. And so it's injured, it's struggling in the roadway, and the CHP officer is reporting on it, often with quite a lot of detail, which is kind of a human side of this, that people, including CHP officers, they're disturbed by that the animal is injured. And about another third of the time, the animal is hit and then it runs off or it can't be found, is probably injured, but we don't necessarily know if that's a fatal event. And then about a third of the time, they're found dead on site. So the animal's hit and it dies right there. This is for medium to larger animals. Smaller animals, we don't know very much at all about what happens to them. But presumably they have similar kinds of, some are injured, some are killed outright on site. So there's mortality effects from collisions with vehicles. And then there's this connectivity or fragmentation effect where populations are separated. And so you can think of this as like a city. In a city, if you have busy streets and freeways, if you don't have crosswalks, underpasses under the highway, or at least ones that you don't want to go through, then you don't know the neighborhood on the other side. You don't know the neighbors on the other side of the street or the neighborhood on the other side of the freeway. And so there's a fragmentation effect that occurs just like it does in human communities. This is established as a potential effect of road development in cities, and it certainly is true for wildlife, which have no adaptation or knowledge about what a roadway is. The corollary to fragmentation is connectivity, and this is the desired. This is desired by you all with the phone in your pocket, and this is desired by wildlife as well, to be able to move across landscapes, to mate, to eat something smaller than them. And so there's a lot of imperatives built into connectivity there. It goes beyond desires. We desire to have a smartphone and be connected. Wildlife need to do it, to eat, to reproduce, and to disperse into different areas. There's probably one of the best road ecologists in the world. And I say this as an overconfident road ecologist, that she's probably smarter than I am, in Carleton University, looked at these two different effects and asked the question, which of these is more important? Which of these should we really be focusing on? Should we only be focusing on fragmentation and connectivity? And I should give some backstory. Most transportation mitigation projects that take place for wildlife involve trying to resolve fragmentation. So after a long history of looking at wildlife and the types of impacts that might be occurring, this seemed like something that transportation could do. They could build a structure. They're engineers. They want to build a structure and get animals from one side to the other and potentially keep them connected. But also occurring at the same time is mortality. The animals are getting hit and they're dying, and that has some unknown impact on the population. But it's a little hard to resolve that. You can do that with fencing to some degree, but in California we have 14,000 miles, and I think this is true, of highway, state highway, 140,000 miles of paved road, and so there's a lot of possible fencing, even if only half of the highways and roads we're talking about are in wild areas. So she did a meta-analysis of available research and said that really we should be focused on preventing mortality as the most important ecological impact, rather than retaining connectivity. In other words, engineering something for animals to get from one side of the road to the other. And this is a really important position or argument to make, because it changes a lot of how we think about transportation and ecosystems, and I'll get to that in a moment. So another type of effect that I mentioned is aversion, and the one that's very well studied or we know more about is potential noise and traffic light effects on wildlife or other organisms approaching roadways. This is State Route 99, or I think it's State Route 99, not US 99, going through the part of the San Joaquin Valley. The colored circles and squares and so forth, these are different natural areas or species that are in the California Natural Diversity Database, which means they're probably protected species, which is why they would show up in that database. And then the purple outline here of this tan area, this is sound going out to background levels. And so the area that's sort of a olivey green near the highway is an area where wildlife living in that area are potentially affected by noise coming from the roadway. So this is a model of noise propagation. And what you would find is that, so there's a band out here which is 2,000 meters, so 2 kilometers. Up to, say, 1 to 3 miles from a busy highway, you're going to have noise above background. Now, just being above background doesn't mean it's harmful. So it has to be a certain amount above background for you to start to be able to measure effects on wildlife populations. But one of the really important ones that's very hard to resolve, and so this is getting to the second half of my talk, is noise and light, because if an animal has an aversion to noise and light on the highway, and it doesn't want to go anywhere near, you can't get it across to the other side. There's not an easy solution to that. And so we think, okay, well, that's going to be true for any road and highway. What does that mean? And if you think globally, back to this map of 1 kilometer away, these are areas that are 1 kilometer away from a road. If you look just at the United States, about half of the country, there's a road within a kilometer of where you are. And so these noise and light effects are potentially affecting wildlife in half of the country. In Europe, it's much worse. In Belgium, where I have a colleague, there's no area that's greater than a kilometer from a road, and even less than that. So substantial parts of the world, including the place we live, there's very few places that are far from this potential impact. The importance of this is that if an animal doesn't go near the road and never wants to go and never wants to cross, then it's never going to get to the other side, and you've essentially divided up populations. One type of solution to this, which I'll get to a little bit more later, but where successful crossing does occur. So these are for wildlife that don't have an aversion to the road necessarily, or their aversion is low. They can go through different structures. This might be built for wildlife. In this case, where the bobcat just walked through is built for drainage. In this case, where that little thermal image of it was a coyote, I think, running under this highway. This is I-90, and WashDOT made this image. This is a high-resolution thermal camera. That was built for wildlife, and for all of these other pictures here, these were all built for wildlife. So wildlife can successfully make it across the road through these structures, and most of these are undercrossings. But we don't know much about going over the road. And so only in the locations where these structures occur do we get some wildlife going through. They're not averse, and they'll move through these structures. In terms of mortality, the total effects of transportation are largely unknown. There have been some estimates, including here in California. In Brazil, and this is not published, this first one, but a road ecologist in Brazil estimated that as many as 400 million mammals per year are killed on roads. It says animals there, but I think it was just for mammals. There's been a couple of published studies that suggest that birds on the order of 100 to 300 million per year are killed on US roads, which is similar order of magnitude to the number killed by cats and the number killed by hitting buildings. So between those three impacts, there's over 1 billion birds per year that die in the US, all from anthropogenic causes. Other non-bird in the US, non-bird, mammal, reptile, amphibian, insects, the impacts to all of those is basically unknown. In California, only for a couple of species do we have any idea at all of how many are getting hit, and these estimates are very broad, 25,000 to 100,000 mule deer per year. And this is from a population of under 1 million, so up to 10% of the population per year is getting killed on roads alone. That's not including hunting or other effects that might occur. So these are a big deal from a wildlife point of view. There's also a human impact. I mentioned that CHP records, they record all incidents, and we collect all of those, about 800,000 a year, which we put in a database, which we're happy to share with anybody who wants to study traffic impacts in general. But we cull from those all the ones related to wildlife. We've done a couple of different things. One is to look at the economic cost to society. So it's just a big round number, $300 million per year approximately. It ranges between 200 and 500 million in terms of our estimate. Some people are killed, 5 to 10 people from a vision zero point of view. That's a big deal. 5 to 10 people killed per year in California from colliding with a wildlife or a domestic animal. And hundreds are injured. And so this is nothing compared to the total killed in all accidents, but it's actually, it's getting up to some of the identified sources of mortality on roads, such as somebody driving with a cell phone in their hand. And then we find that a lot of people are really concerned about these accidents when they're involved in them. As you can imagine, when you're driving on a freeway, if you're going out to, or just out on a highway up to Big Bear, or on a I-5 going up north into the Central Valley, or 15 down towards San Diego, any of those areas you could potentially collide with an animal, and if you're going 75 miles an hour, that is a huge thing. Even if people aren't really scared from the collision, the CHP reports that people get out of their car, they're very concerned if the animal's injured, they'll stop traffic, they'll beg for CHP to save the animals somehow. And so the level of concern is very high for people on site. And then, as we know, a lot of us we care about wildlife in kind of a general way. And if we know about the impact, we're going to have some level of concern about it. So there's a human impact to this as well. OK. Now, we don't know very much in California, but we do know something. We have a roadkill monitoring system, which I'll show you on the next slide. And we've only had, it's quite a large system. It's not the largest in the world. It used to be, but now it's second or third. In 430 species of about 600 or so, 600 to 700 species that are part of full-time residents in California. 430 of them have showed up as roadkill in our system for about 10% of the roads that we've looked at. We've looked at 10% of the total road system. And for some of these species in some areas, like the mountain lions, this one is on State Route 13 in the Bay Area, this can be one of the main sources of mortality and impact to the population. For most other species, we don't know. For those interested in just seeing what the data look like or collecting data, you can join the California Roadkill Observation System. It's a very, very easy browser web app here where you take a picture of a roadkill, you click that green button, and then you upload the pic, and you're done. We have about 100,000 events so far in our GIS database from this recording. Here's a map on the lower right of all of those, which doesn't mean a whole lot when you just map them all like that, except to show that we cover most of the state geographically. But when you zoom in, you'll see there's big gaps. There are other systems like this in the world, and these have all grown over the last 10 years fairly rapidly, about half of them over the last 5 years, and they all involve the public. Most of them involve government agencies, and they have usually a very enthusiastic base of humans involved in doing this, which is another type of concern that we're measuring. The way this system works is that you take a picture with your location on, click save, and then our system takes care of the rest, retrieves the EXIF data. You can or you don't have to identify the species, and then we have a database record. So it's an easy way to collect a lot of data about this mortality event. Now, that is all well and good, but what does it mean? And this is where it gets a little more tricky, is figuring out what kind of impact are we talking about? Where is it? How big is it? How important is it? And this is where we can do some things and not other really important things. One of the things we can do is identify where there are high densities of these types of collisions. This map on the left shows higher densities in the more red colors and low or no reports in the green for collisions with large mammals only. This isn't the, if you remember this map back here where you've got all these birds and reptiles and amphibians as well. So this is just for collisions with large mammals. These are important, these are important ecologically, but they're really, really important socially because these are the animals that people think about and they see, and potentially they'll spend millions of dollars putting a crossing structure over a highway that hopefully will also benefit the other smaller animals that people don't spend as much time thinking about. So the importance of this is partly for its ecological importance, but mostly it has a social impact that otherwise would be hard to generate. With a map like this, you can zoom into, here's SoCal over here on the top right, and the reddish areas are areas where if you built a structure, it would pay for itself in reduced collisions. What that means is that if you put fencing and a crossing structure in any of these red areas and heavily reduced or eliminated the collisions, the reduced cost to society would pay for the cost of the structure, usually within a few years, which is far less than the lifetime of the project itself. So the B to C ratio here is very high, benefit to cost. And then this just shows you the source of the data, and these are the wildlife vehicle collisions. These are the ones reported by CHP, and you can see that they're in a lot of different parts of the region, although obviously not so much in central LA. We developed a tool actually with funding from PSR to do hotspots analysis for California and for any area of the country. And we call this our hotspots tool. And so the map prior here showing densities of collisions. We are able to do this automatically, and anybody can do this for any set of US highways for any state. And now we're working on smaller roads as well. So in New Jersey, there was an area that people were interested in that we put in a different map for that region of New Jersey, and we're doing that for part of Mexico. Important also in this tool is a real-time map. This is from this morning. The collisions in California right now that resulted in either a CHP report or it was a report in our Roadkill Observation system. And these are all larger animal collisions. Underlying this is, you can't see so much where the hotspots are because the dots are usually where the hotspots are. And so I put the hotspot map down here in the bottom right. But another thing that's important about this, and we just had the largest baked goods distributor company in the US distributes throughout California, and they wanted our hotspots maps so that they could tell their drivers where to watch out for collisions with larger animals. I thought, wow, that's an unusual request, but we complied with it right away. So the underlying map of where the hotspots are and where recent collisions are can actually be used either in human-mediated or automated systems for warning drivers. How predictable are these collisions? And this is getting closer to where it's how do we solve these things. One thing that California does, like most states, is try to use what are called connectivity maps to try to predict where a collision is going to occur and therefore where should the state invest money. If you read ahead, you'll see that this isn't necessarily a good idea. But I'm showing different maps throughout different parts of California over here on the right. And basically, where the animals are getting hit doesn't line up with the predictive connectivity map here in the light green. The importance of this is not just an academic exercise. It started as an academic exercise, but now this is used as the basis for fund distribution to solve conflict, wildlife vehicle conflict on highways. So the green areas are where you can get more money to build a crossing structure or some other kind of action. And then the red and yellow dots are where the collisions are actually occurring. And unfortunately, they don't line up, which is a policy problem. Why is this the case? It's really hard to say, but I think it comes down to, see that little thing crawling around there? I have no idea what that is, but it's doing its little thing. Now, this is at centimeter scale. This thing is only about half a centimeter long, half an inch long, and it's walking around doing its thing. And this is essentially a small version of what's going on across all these landscapes and across the whole world, is that wildlife are moving around, doing their thing, collecting food, finding somewhere to live, going back to where they live, going from the fridge to the living room. And we've built roads across those, and so their biological imperative is fragmented by our activities. Another form of predictability is to take past events and see if it predicts future events. This seems to work. This is a MaxEnt model, maximum entropy model, run with a colleague named Ho Han Han in Auburn University. And it's basically using past events to predict future events. And so we train the models with part of the data and test it with the other part, and it seems to work pretty well, about 80% predictive ability to tell us where future collisions might occur with, here's the top left is ungulates. These are deer, elk, but most of these points here are deer. Most of the places here are deer. There's not very many elk in this region. This is part of California. Here's the Bay Area on the left. Avian, so these are bird strikes, and medium mammals, C, bottom left, and the map on the bottom right is for small mammals. And what you'll notice about these, even though I'm telling you that it has high predictive capacity, is that there's a lot of red areas. And this gets back to that previous little video, which I thought was really cute, but it tells part of the story that animals are going to move around everywhere they feel like it and that they can. And we don't always know where that's going to be. In this case, we can tell where it was, and hopefully that's a prediction of where it's going to be in the future. And maybe if you did something about it in these red areas, you'd reduce the chance of impact. But again, there's a lot of red areas. So what do we do about that? Another important thing is that this is a really simplified view of, this could be in Southern California, I guess maybe, I don't know if you have Martin. Let's say it's Southern Sierra Nevada. And so you've got these different kinds of wildlife. They're eating each other, some of them are competing with each other, suppressing each other. For example, larger predators here at the top will tend to suppress smaller predators. And so all of these interactions are taking place in nature. And these are all different species that, except for probably the either check a spot butterfly there at the bottom, these are all species we've seen as roadkill. And so if you differentially kill off, let's say that the animals with the X are the ones that are getting hit on roads because they don't have a good way of moving across roads. Then if you differentially affect these different wildlife populations, if you kill off the things with the red cross on them, you're going to affect this food web. It will no longer be the same. You'll have simplified it. You'll have changed the interactions. And so we can have an ecosystem impact because we're influencing these influencers. Don't you wish we could just do that with influencers? We can just put little red X's on. So as we change the populations of these different wildlife species, we're going to change the ecosystem processes. And there's some really important species in California that are affected in this way. Here's 3 examples: mountain lion, coyote, and black bear. And all of them are large. They all have big effects on other wildlife and on ecosystems in general. And they're all hit frequently on roads, pretty much wherever they live in California. So we don't know what impact that has, but we do know that in the case of mountain lion or puma, it's now leading to or contributing to the listing of mountain lion as endangered in California, which will have a potentially big effect on future transportation projects. When you have an endangered species that's known to be impacted, you have to do something about it. And we're disconnecting these different parts of different ecosystems and parts of ecosystems because we're killing off animals on the highway. And so that's going to cause the ecosystems that are affected by these species to also be impacted. So if you think about here in Southern California, you've got a lot of coyote and mountain lion that are being hit. And so you're taking out these top predators. You're going to fundamentally change the ecosystem. OK, what do we do about it? The endangered species part of this equation, when we think about what can we do about these types of impacts, there's a variety of different endangered species that are affected. Some of them are affected because of transportation. Some of them are listed, at least in part, because of transportation. And so transportation impacts have caused those species to become more endangered and therefore more likely to be protected. And we have different laws in California and federally on what do you have to do about this, what do you have to analyze. And if you have a protected species, you have to analyze is that, if it's in an area, is that species being affected by your project? So there's a requirement to analyze, and there should be a requirement to do something about it, but that's where it gets a little fuzzy. These acronyms, Endangered Species Act, National Environmental Protection Act, California Environmental Quality Act, and Migratory Bird Treaty Act. Those are all different ways that we've decided to use policy to protect endangered species or protected species from our activities, in this case, transportation. And there's a workflow that goes along with that, and this is highly simplified. But essentially, you collect data about your species that you're concerned about or habitat types. You assess that impact. Is it a big deal or is it nothing? This is where things are very tricky scientifically. Actually, this whole spectrum here. And then the last thing, you devote some money to mitigating the impact so that you can go forward with the project. Unfortunately, what happens a lot is that we get stopped on this first part of the workflow, is the collecting the data. There's not very much data available for most species and ecosystems across most years in California, and it's usually low enough resolution that we don't necessarily know for most species what their status is in that area. Do they actually occur? Has there been data collection in the past? There hasn't been. Oh, you're going to do it now. How long will you do it for? Sometimes just for a few months. And so the data collection part of this is often where things fall apart. Assessing the impact, we rarely know enough about ecosystems to even know how big of a deal, if we do collect the data, how big a deal the impact will be on species or ecosystems. And therefore, it becomes difficult to justify some kind of mitigation. Now, I put this example here of other industries, and this is a story as old as environmental impacts have been looked at, or health impacts. If you don't collect the data in the first place, you're never going to get to the end of the workflow. And this is where we find the most problem with environmental data collection, is just not collecting the data. This has been true in the oil industry, tobacco for health, pharmaceuticals for health, sugar for health, and agriculture for primarily environmental impacts. If you don't collect the data in the first place, and certainly if you don't assess the impacts, there's no way to rationalize mitigating the impact. Now, for wildlife, this is starting to change. I listed some states here where you can see a reflection of the public concern for wildlife impacts from transportation starting to come out sometimes in policy, usually more in a state program to try to get more money devoted and more crossing structures built, for example, and then throughout the world. So for example, the Netherlands just completed over 100 different wildlife crossing structures over the last 10 to 20 years. I don't remember the number. And they've said they've reconnected the country through those wildlife crossing structures. Yet to be determined if that's true, but it certainly was an ambitious program. So we really struggle with this workflow, and this is just for protected species, let alone for less protected species. In theory, your solution building begins with the collection of data and your analysis of those data. If we say, okay, well, what theoretically should that look like? In some cases, this is true in practice as well. We collect data about crashes. These are mostly involving large wildlife, although there's an unrecognized class of accidents which occur from people swerving to avoid hitting an animal. I've done that myself. It is scary. Roadkill carcasses, where do you find things that are dead? And then this last one, ecological or genetic impacts, what happens to the wildlife populations as a result of all of these collisions. So there's different kinds of data. There's more, but these are some of them that we can use to start to build a solution. And then there's different actors involved. And they're going to vary in their level of involvement, the enthusiasm about involvement, depending on where you are or the requirements that they have. I think that for a lot of developed areas, you do see that trajectory, and we may continue to see it. If you look at some of the shared vehicle and fuels and other literature related to modifications of transportation, they say that single occupancy vehicles are not going away. If you solve electrification and everybody still wants their own car, then it'll keep looking like it's looking, but worse from a traffic point of view. So from a wildlife point of view, the electric car is actually maybe even worse because you can't hear it coming if you're trying to cross the road, or it's better if you're afraid of noisy cars. So there's potentially situation stays the same or gets worse. And then from a homework, separation, all the land use planning, transportation nexus that has led to a lot of the problems certainly we have down here and up north in commuter areas. Even when you start looking at sea level rise impacts, climate change impacts, and you've got these really big fundamental effects that could be occurring, people don't talk about resolving those impacts, even in the face of poverty. And there's a lot of things that would lead you to, you need to fix that thing, and we haven't got back to there. Back, because I say we've been having this discussion for 20, 30 years or more. So I see the trajectory is going in that direction. I think what will happen is we'll run out of steam, so to speak, and even we'll run out of fossil fuels and we'll run out of lots of things. But I think that's really, that very cynical projection means that whatever's left behind is the stuff that gets to survive. In Belgium, you have very simplified ecosystems because they've lost, a wolf showed up recently in the southern Netherlands near Belgium, and so I think that maybe they'll get some of the top predators back. But it's a very simplified ecosystem, and what happens besides the loss of the ecosystem function, you get this other effect, which many of us here have, which is your changing baseline expectation is occurring at the same time. So what my grandparents grew up with, my parents grew up with, I grew up with, what you guys grow up with, is changing, right? And it's generally getting more degraded. Your acceptance of that is natural. You accept it as status quo. Right. Right. Even if you read it, what does twice as many species mean to you? Like, what? How do you connect with that, right? So you could end up in Belgium and think it's totally fine, and that's one of the hazards of how we develop as uncivilized societies, is that we don't have that kind of feedback loop that allows us to modify what we're doing in the moment we're doing it. We look back and we say, oh, those primitive people who built cities with curvy streets, they're not grids, or why didn't they invent the wheel earlier, whatever. It's like we keep doing those same things, it's just our version of it. So I think that the bottom line is that, and I'll come to it at the end, is that you have to make those conscious leaps as societies. And there's not a legislative solution, there's not other kinds of solutions except for that. But I'll try to get back to not the level that you're talking about, but a more mundane level and then you can re-ask the question. Okay, so these different actors, one way that you can think about these solutions is that, and this is often how it's done, is that they're based on opportunities. What are the opportunities to act? And I show here a map on the right. These are in a 2017 data set of SB1 funded projects throughout California. There were a little over 1,000 at the time. I think there's more now. And we lined those up with hotspots at the time, so back in, this is a couple years ago, and there were 120 locations where high wildlife vehicle collision locations were co-aligned with SB1 projects. Considering that most of these are in the future, this in theory would be a way to get some of those solutions built, because you can opportunistically leap onto an SB1 project and say, hey, you should do something about the wildlife impact that's taking place. Another source of projects is the SHOP plan. This shows a lot of state and local priorities throughout different parts of California. It shows timeline and investments. So this is one way that you could jump opportunistically on opportunities to try to resolve some of these problems. Another is to look at what works. And there's coincidentally right now going on a webinar by somebody in Montana talking about some of what works and what doesn't work. And for this same issue, signs are ineffective. So here's a sign, here's a dead deer under it. That was a great coincidence, but it still means probably that signs don't work. Animals are still going to get hit. Under crossings, here's an example here under State Route 50 in Northern California. They're pretty effective. We got our first mountain lion here. Hopefully it was going through. It was definitely eating a deer right at the opening of the crossing structure about a year ago. And then overcrossings. And here's one in Colorado showing deer going across. And I should point out that most of these are built for deer, and they're mostly functional for deer, but not much else, some other things. And then here's an overcrossing proposed to cross 101 in Agoura Hills. This is the Liberty Canyon overcrossing. And the initial estimate was around 30 to 50 million. The estimate has now gone up to closer to 100 million. So it'll be potentially the biggest crossing structure in the world, certainly the most expensive in the world. And it's probably going to be pretty effective. And it's being well designed. It's a great group of people, including myself. So I can say that it's a great group of people trying to make this be really effective. But these are some of the engineering solutions that I talked about. There's also a couple here. One piece of speculative fiction from Richard Foreman and Dan Sperling, some of the originators of road ecology. They said, why don't we elevate roads or transportation systems in general? Or in the case of Australia, they actually buried a road to get it out of the way. Why don't we change where these things are so they're not impacting human communities and wildlife and so forth? And so that was a really interesting paper. And then another idea, which sounds really weird, but this is kind of like saying, hey, why don't we make fire or invent the wheel? Let's just remove the roads altogether where they're not working out. Now, not working out for who? Not working out for nature. So with this kind of idea in mind, and this does take place for dirt roads in forested areas, there is road removal, but we really don't consider this as something reasonable. It'd be like saying, leave your phone at home, don't take it with you, or don't go on a social media platform. Like that's just like, what are you talking about? That's ridiculous. Okay, but it's something that we have to imagine. We have to think about, is there a way that we can modify transportation systems so that they don't have the kinds of impacts that I'm talking about. Another part of the solution building is how do you pay for it? And here's some examples. Washington State DOT, I-90, this is a magnificent program. Really, I just love it. They know that there's these huge problems, and they've been trying to fix it programmatically using a combination of federal and state funding. I'm not sure if they have private funding. A Highway 9 project in Colorado started with private funding from a rancher who lived on one side, wanted crossing structures. He was tired of seeing the animals getting hit, and it eventually got state and federal funding. And then 101 has really been triggered in a lot of ways by Mr. DiCaprio committing $5 million and a bunch of other people, and then that eventually led to what's probably going to be mostly a publicly funded project. But these crossing structures are only partially effective. And what that means is that animals will go through them, but not all of them. And so if you think about that food web, we do have animals that will use these structures, go from one side to the other of the highway, but only about half of the animals only half of the species that are nearby. Now, maybe after 10 years, every single species, at least one individual has gone through, but from a day-to-day point of view, having only half of the species want to go through is kind of a problem. It's not just kind of a problem, it's a huge, significant problem. Another thing is that this is, you can't, as I mentioned before, you can't build your way out of aversion. So if wildlife have an aversive response to highways, you're never going to build something that gets them out of that problem. And so we won't actually solve the ecological problem using crossing structures. Another thing about crossing structures is that when they are built, we know a lot about the species counts that go through. Hey, there were 27,000 deer and 32 rabbits and a coyote, but we don't necessarily know what the ecological benefits are. We can count the number of animals, but we don't know the ecological benefits. It'd be kind of like if you sat out on exposition and you counted cars going from left to right, and you tried to make a statement about transportation systems. It just is not effective. So we really need to know what the ecological benefits of these different structures are. One way that we're doing this, and this is, I'm sorry, but only about counting the animals and not necessarily about the impacts, but getting us to a more accurate count, is to use an automated machine learning-based tool or series of tools to identify animals in pictures and automatically count them. Not yet successful in automatically identifying them, except for deer, which are very common, so it's easy to train the model. If any of you are interested in AI and want to discuss this, I'm happy to do so. Another is looking at wildlife behavior, and so this red to green set of colors, this is at Liberty Canyon, shows the propagation of sound from the location of the proposed crossing structure across the landscape to the north. Very near the highway is very loud. Further away is background, probably no surprise. And so there's a lot of noise immediately adjacent to the highway and at the location of the crossing structure. Another important thing is that the wildlife may or may not be behaving differently. This is very preliminary data. So we have cameras that were out across this landscape and 25 cameras across this landscape to see what wildlife are actually present. And so we can see what their preferences are, their behavior is in response to this soundscape, which is their reality. And then we can get closer to the idea of, can we build our way, can we build a solution that includes wildlife behavior and preferences as part of the solution building. There's no requirement, no legislation for how you do this stuff. And so it's often dependent on a group of people to start it. Sometimes it's somebody within Caltrans. District 7 and 8 are very proactive this way. District 3, and there's individuals in those districts at Caltrans that, even though it's not required, have started these kinds of processes going. And this workflow here shows a very common way that you could carry out this kind of activity of acknowledging there's some kind of problem, some impact to wildlife, which is true pretty much anywhere you have a road and some nature, and then go through these steps to say what should we do about it and how should we determine if it was effective. The last 2 points here, is it effective and is it sufficient, are the parts that are usually left out. And arguably, these are the most important parts, including the very first question is, should you even spend any money on this problem? We just don't know very much about how effective these processes are and how sufficient they are. Involving the public has become very important. Liberty Canyon overcrossing probably wouldn't happen without things like P22 Day and the National Wildlife Federation getting out there and developing these ad hoc systems, these non-legislative systems to fix wildlife impacts. But again, we don't know how effective this is. We don't know if it's sufficient. Can you do this everywhere, or is it only good at Liberty Canyon or in Southern California for mountain lions? Here's an example of a project that was here yesterday out here in the desert. So Yucca Valley here, Joshua Tree is out in that direction to the right, and I-10 is down at the bottom of the picture. And this is a multifaceted project that Caltrans came up with. Caltrans District 8 hired a group of us to look at how do you get wildlife across the road, how do you reduce the impacts that are present on the roadway. And so it's really thinking about how do we backfill the problems or solve the problems we've created. There'll be light measurements by Travis Longcore, connectivity modeling, camera traps, soundscapes, mortality measurements, a lot of different wildlife impacts that are going to be measured here. A project that's earlier in its development, this is in the Bay Area, is looking at part of the East Bay where there's multiple highways where we have two important types of effects. One is a barrier effect where we get very few wildlife on the highway. They're basically not approaching the highway and not getting killed there. And so that needs to be solved somehow. And then there's another one, you see this cluster of red dots in the map at the bottom right. That's all the collisions. And this is a really important and different kind of solution to solve that part of the highway. So circling back around to what is ecologically sustainable transportation is trying to solve a lot of the impacts that I described from this ecological point of view. So identify them as ecological impacts, try to find solutions that actually work for the ecology, and reconnect landscapes that we have fragmented. There's obviously a lot of benefit to also reducing the mortality, but we don't necessarily know much about that and how effective that could be. I just want to finish up with this idea that if we have this idea of sustainable transportation, and if we think ecology is an important part of that, then we need to ask some really important questions. Is it possible to use our transportation technology, our engineering approaches to protect nature, basically protect nature from ourselves? And what if it's not possible to do it with current technology? Would we actually change the transportation system to protect nature? Is that something we take seriously? And what happens to nature if we don't do this? And that's going back to his example of the earlier question of, if we look like Belgium eventually, then what does that mean? Do we want that? No offense to Belgium. None taken. Okay, so here's some links for anybody who wants to collect some more information about some of the things we do. roadecology.ucdavis.edu, a couple of our different roadkill monitoring systems, including this global one that shows you all the global systems that are doing this. Our camera trap website, which is where the machine learning tool will be. And if anybody wants to email me, there's my email address at the bottom. Thank you very much. I'll take any questions that you guys have. So the question synopsis was, for a proposed highway and co-aligned rail and bikeway project where the highway component is taken out, do we know whether or not you're going to have similar impacts from the remaining transportation infrastructure? I think that's the basis of it. And so rail has different kinds of impacts, but a lot of similar impacts. So for example, if you have an elevated rail bed, which most of them are through a flat area like around Victorville, then you have a surface that very few animals will want to cross. Hooved animals won't. Amphibians seem to stay away. Reptiles, sometimes they'll go through. And it looks a bit like a steep wall, so the Mojave Desert tortoise won't go across. And so there's a lot of potential impacts from the rail by itself. It's probably less impact than the rail plus highway. If they're co-aligned, then animals coming from one side may never see the other transportation infrastructure because they never get there. But the co-alignment means you're going to have the effects of both. And the rail by itself means you'll just get the effects of rail. What are those? Goes back to the earlier slide of don't collect the data, you don't have to mitigate the problem. So for a lot of things, we don't actually know what the impacts of the rail alignments are. For a few things we do. And for a few species, we know whether or not they'll even go to them. Yeah, so the question is about light pollution impacts from roadways as opposed to noise. And noise and light, both coming from vehicles, the physics of light and noise, loss over distance in a just atmosphere should be similar. But we find that it's actually different on real landscapes, unfortunately, because we were hoping we could just measure one and it would tell you something about the other. So the propagation is different in terms of reflection and absorption, and the effects seem to be different too, where light gives us a more easy to figure out effect. We have fewer wildlife showing up where it's brighter than where it's darker in a more predictable way than with noise. Noise is noisier. The data is noisier, and the significance is lower for the effect. But the effect is there for both. And so they originate from the same place. They have slightly different dissipations and slightly different effects, but it's similar enough that you could say where you have traffic noise and light, you're going to have this aversion effect, and you'll have loss of wildlife in those bright, noisy areas compared to further away.